Subscribe to The Honest Critique for current affairs, movie, book, and product reviews. Also, make sure you press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video. The views, information, or opinions expressed during the video series are solely those of the individuals and do not necessarily represent those of The Honest Critique and its employees. The following video contains strong language which may be offensive to some viewers. Viewer discretion advised.
So hello and welcome to a very special episode we are recording today. I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Richard Landis, who was trained as a medievalist and taught in the Boston University History Department. I'm delighted to be joined for a discussion on his recent book, Can the Whole World Be Wrong? So thank you so much, sir, for taking your time and speaking to us.
Thank you.
Let me start the conversation with what motivated you to write this book, Can the Whole World Be Wrong? Lethal Journalism, Antisemitism, and Global Jihad. If you could lay down what the book is a little about and what motivated you to write this book.
All right. Well, actually, the original title, and I've been working on it for a decade, the original title was They're So Smart Because We're So Stupid, which was inspired by the success of both the story about Muhammad Abdullah in 2000 being killed by Israeli troops, 12-year-old boy in Netzarim Junction in Gaza, and then again by the Jenin massacre of 2002. And in both cases, these stories were patently false, and yet they succeeded. And after hearing people tell me, oh, the Palestinians are so clever at their cognitive war, their propaganda against Israel. And I remember thinking, it's not that they're clever, it's that we're stupid. They say things and we believe them. For instance, during Jenin, there were no journalists allowed in for the 3 weeks of the operation. So 3 weeks of urban warfare in the Jenin refugee camp. And the Palestinians are saying the Israelis are lining people up and shooting them and burying them in mass graves and bulldozing them over, which is a clear allusion to what the Nazis did in World War II with Jews. And the press was reporting it like it was news. And so, starting all the way back in 2003, I got involved in the story both of Jenin and Al-Dura, which are chapters 1 and 3 of my book. And then it just went on. I coined the couple of terms, lethal journalism, which is reporting one side's war propaganda as news in a foreign conflict, and then own goal war journalism, which is reporting your enemy's news in a conflict. And part of it was that the West didn't understand that the Palestinians were actually on the other side. They were in favor of global jihad. They cheered 9/11, but then intimidated the press into not showing 9/11. Arafat was so worried about the footage of people cheering 9/11 that he did a fake news story about giving blood, whereas as Charles Andelin, the reporter who reported the Muhammad Abdullah story, mentioned as an aside in a press conference or a talk that he gave at Harvard in 2008, that the whole thing was staged because Arafat has a fear of needles. And in fact, if you look at the pictures, there are no needles, there's nothing of the sort. But the press reported it as if it were true. And that's the Western press. So, over the years, I was collecting all of these insane stories of how the Western press was reporting Palestinian war propaganda as news, and not only hurting Israel, but hurting themselves. So, for example, in Jenin 2002, there were demonstrations in the West of people wearing mock suicide belts to show their solidarity with the Palestinian people, when in fact those mock suicide belts were showing solidarity with people who were about to target the West, who had already targeted the West in 2001 with 9/11, but then, Barcelona in 2000, Madrid in 2004, London in 2005, and the list goes on and on. So, in a sense, initially the title was "They're So Smart Because We're So Stupid," a medievalist guide to the 21st century. And then by the time it came to press, my daughters convinced me that I can't insult my readership by calling them stupid. And so I said, "Can the whole world be wrong?" Partly because in 1893, Echad Ha'am, who was in the Ukraine at the time, wrote an essay called "Can the Whole World Be Wrong?" And he was talking about how when Jews said, in response to the blood libel accusations, said, "But we don't do that," the response was, "Can the whole world be wrong and the Jews be right?" And then in Jenin, Kofi Annan, who was then the Secretary General of the United Nations, when he was told that the Israelis were not going to leave Jenin until they finished the job, which is what's happening in Gaza right now, said, "Can the whole world be wrong and Israel be right?" Or actually, he said, "I don't think the whole world can be wrong and Israel be right." So you have this phenomenon, which is, I don't know whether in India you're familiar with the Hans Christian Andersen story about the emperor's new clothes. But he goes out naked because everybody in his court tells him, "Oh, what beautiful clothes." It's a long story. I won't go into the details, but the point is here, what we have is a situation where everybody, not everybody, but the press and the intelligentsia in the West is all convinced that these things are true. And in fact, they're wrong. And in fact, if you had to choose between Israel fighting suicide bombers in Jenin, if you're siding with the suicide bombers in Jenin, that's a real problem. You got it wrong. But because everybody agrees they're right, they all think they're right. So I wrote the book to explain it. I have 4 chapters that look at historical incidents: the Adura story in 2000, the 9/11 attack in 2001, Jenin in 2002, and the last historical chapter is about the Danish cartoon scandal. And then I go into the players. I have a chapter on honor shame culture in the Arab world and why Arafat said no to a peace deal in 2000. A chapter on what I call the Califators, who are Muslims who believe that this is the time, in this generation, there will be a global caliphate. I have a chapter on liberals who project their own mentality onto other people. So they think, like us. If we're nice to them, they'll be nice to us, which is not the case. And the whole proposal of land for peace in the peace process, the Oslo peace process, was viewed by an honor shame culture headed by Arafat as land for war. The more they concede, the better our position to continue our war. A chapter on the progressive left, which embraced the accusations against Israel and went into sort of hyper mode of saying, "Oh, Israel is the new Nazis." And we hear that widespread now. We hear people accusing Israel of genocide, including Rashida Tlaib, who's a congresswoman in Washington. A chapter on this lethal journalism, which is maybe the longest in the book. A chapter on what I call Jews against themselves, which is all the Jews who sided with the Palestinians. And then the last part of the book just goes through what happened since those early 2000 incidents that just compounded the problem. So that was the book. I was writing it for a while, and I finally got it out.
And the reason, Professor, I chose to have this discussion right now, and it's very relevant for our Indian audience as well, because your book seems to challenge the mainstream media's portrayal of certain events. And back home, here in India as well, we have a problem with certain misinterpretation of, or major misinterpretation of biases in Western journalism.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that, probably in the context of what we've been seeing in this current war between Israel and Hamas as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm working on it right now as we speak. But the on October 17th, there was a blast at a hospital in Gaza, Al Ahli Hospital in Gaza City. And Hamas, and this is 10 days after they had shown who they really were in southern Israel, really, staggeringly brutal, vicious attack on civilians, babies, women, you name it, claims that Israel had bombed the hospital and killed hundreds of people, 500 people, and that the numbers would rise as a result of when the bodies were dug out from the rubble. Now, what we knew the next morning when we saw photos of the strike was that it was a minimal strike. It didn't touch the hospital. I mean, there were a couple of windows blown out, but there were no operating room ceilings collapsing, as was reported. There were no pictures of more than about 20 bodies. And yet the media not only jumped on the story immediately as Israel strike kills hundreds, or 500 in the New York Times, 500 kills 500 in hospital strike. But when it turned out that they had to remove Israel because Israel countered that it was not them, it was a Palestinian rocket, they kept the story of the massive blow. They kept telling about how when bodies are dug out from the rubble, which wasn't there was no rubble. And when they finally got the pictures of it, they weren't discussing how they got it wrong. They were discussing how the main story is that this story of the hospital blast, and they still have chyrons at the bottom running, hundreds believed killed in hospital blast, was ruining Biden's trip to Israel. The whole area was inflamed with riots and demonstrations, and it was really like looking at arsonists who were admiring the fire. They didn't set the fire, but they sure helped spread it. And there's no acknowledgement, or there's minimal acknowledgement that they got it wrong. And there's certainly no real self-examination of how we could have been fooled. I mean, one of the most striking things is they kept running, this is CNN, they kept running a set of pictures from the hospital blast, which were close-ups of single bodies or maybe two bodies and ambulances and so on and so forth. There were no pictures of the site. There were no pictures of the hospital allegedly destroyed by this, no pictures of the rubble. And yet their imaginations were so fired by the tale that they ran these pictures as if they were proof, when in fact they were disproof of the claims they were making. And I can't emphasize how massive this hospital coverage was in terms of not just inflaming the Muslim world, but inflaming the supporters of Hamas in the United States, who for 10 days were on the defensive because they were defending mass murderers, and people were writing articles about their genocidal ideology and so on and so forth. And now with this hospital strike, all of that got buried, and all of a sudden it was the poor Palestinians. So it's staggeringly, I call it reporting under the influence, and it's reporting under the influence of Hamas propaganda. And even though they say Hamas, it doesn't occur to them. I mean, it's almost like after 7/10, after the attack in Israel, 10 days later, they get a report from Hamas. They report it in the headlines as news, and then Palestinians say. It's almost as if they're thinking, well, they may massacre Jews, but they wouldn't lie to us.
Gazan Health Ministry.
Yeah.
Or even, for the matter of fact, the Gazan Health Ministry that they use, the term. As if Gazan Health Ministry is run by the Hamas.
Yes, yes. And they would even say that, but it's not like they would say that more or less to cover their rears, but it's not like it stopped them from absorbing the propaganda. So, for instance, the Hamas ministry made a number of points about how there were thousands there who were taking refuge from the bombing, how there were more bodies that were going to be dug out of the rubble, how this is a horrific attack. That was the English translation of the statement. And these are all picked up and made their own by the CNN reporters. They're talking about the horrific attack over and over again. They're talking about the rubble throughout the night. I'm just looking at what they cover the next day, and they finally have images of the parking lot and the tiny crater that caused it. And they're still not discussing this. They're still playing the both sides blame the other game. So it's just, I mean, they swallowed Hamas propaganda whole and fed it to the world audience. And the BBC did the same. And I haven't looked at France 24 yet, but I suspect that they did the same thing.
And one of the things or concepts you have discussed in the book, which plays a role in misperceptions or misunderstanding between the Western world and the Islamist movement, you use this concept called cognitive egocentrism.
Right.
So could you discuss this concept a little bit and elaborate on how this plays a role in this misperception?
Yeah, it's huge. Cognitive egocentrism is a term that was actually coined by a psychologist who was working with teenage boys. And he said, look, teenage boys think about nothing but sex. And they assume that everybody thinks the way they do. They assume that everybody thinks of nothing but sex. Well, here we have a case of liberal cognitive egocentrism, which is we are raised in the West to believe in positive sum win-win solutions. Everybody comes out with something. Everybody compromises something. If you're nice to other people, they'll be nice to you. All of these things that work. They work in the kindergarten. They work in negotiations, at least sometimes. It's a good principle. But when you run up against a hard zero-sum society, and you project that onto them, you're making a critical mistake. So, for instance, I think I mentioned it briefly in the Oslo peace process. The slogan was "Land for Peace," and the other slogan was "You don't make friends with friends. You make friends. If you want to make peace, you have to make friends with enemies." Well, if it's possible to make friends with enemies, okay. But if the enemies say, as Arafat said in South Africa, to a largely Indian subcontinent Muslim population, thinking he was speaking just amongst Muslims who were critical of him for signing this Peace of the Brave. And he said, listen, it's like the Treaty of Hudaybiyah that Muhammad made with the people of Mecca because he was in a weak position. But as soon as he was in a strong position, he dropped the pretense and attacked the Meccans and took the city. And that's what he said he was doing with Israel. And amazingly, there was a whole media in Israel that was committed to what they themselves called peace journalism, which was the idea that you shouldn't focus on the negative stuff, you should focus on the positive stuff. So this story of the Hudaybiyah Treaty was only talked about within the quote-unquote right-wing press. Now, they were right. And in 2000, when the Palestinians called it the Al-Aqsa Intifada. I call it the Oslo Jihad. When that broke out, instead of the peace camp, which had been saying all along, we have to give more, saying we made a mistake, what they did was instead to say it's because we didn't give more. Now, if the mindset, the zero-sum mindset of the Palestinians is our goal is to get rid of Israel, And we will do this by, at least some, Hamas wasn't even willing to take the long route and say, okay, we'll pretend to make peace with them. We'll get as much as we can in concessions, and then we'll continue the war. So, in other words, land for war. And here are the cognitive, egocentric Israelis imagining land for peace and wanting to give more to the Palestinians as a way to achieve that peace. You really have a terribly, you got a total miscommunication which favors the Palestinians. And what happened after 2000 was that the peace camp, which lost all of its credibility in Israel because the Israelis were suffering from the suicide terror war that was hitting them. They went out west, and they went to the west, and they got professorships at universities in England, and they basically taught and argued that Israel was responsible for the failure, and that the West should force Israel to make concessions as a way of achieving peace. And they were literally absolutely convinced that it would bring peace. I asked a friend of mine who was in J Street, on the board of J Street. And I said, do you really think that if we go back to the 67 borders, there will be peace? And his response was, absolutely. Now, as far as I can make out, there would be war. And there was war, even with the minor concessions, even with we made significant concessions, including allowing Arafat back into the Palestinian territories. And so you really had this sort of campaign against Israel by people who thought they were fighting for peace, but who in their egocentrism couldn't recognize that they were dealing with a real enemy. And now one of the interesting things that's happening is a number of people who are big in the peace camp, Shlomi Eldar, Gershon Baskin, and so on, are writing sort of mea culpas and saying, I misjudged. I didn't realize how much they hated us. And in fact, one of them was interviewed on Israeli TV. And he said, I called my friend Ish Shalom, the man of peace, on the Palestinian side. And I said to him, did you think that Hamas was capable of this? And he laughed in my face and said, everybody knew that, just you stupid Israelis. Only you believe that. And that's the cognitive egocentrism that is not only killing us, it's killing democracies around the world.
So, but I would want to ask you a little bit about something which is an interest to a lot of our viewers, and probably this is one thing that we're looking closely at the Western society. You mentioned something, a term called Calipat, and how this concept has become an overarching theme in your book.
Right.
If you could define a little bit about what you mean by the Calipat and how groups like Hamas is a Calipat. And I want to go a little bit on that and ask you one more thing about, you've argued that the West is becoming a cusp of actually being conquered by radical Islam in some sort. And we have seen, for example, the rallies in Britain. We have seen what's happening in US. We have seen what's happening in France. How is this evidence and reasoning behind this certain growth of people who are this caliphate reaching Western societies, affecting it in the larger realm?
Right. Okay. So first of all, just a little background on my work. My academic specialty, in addition to the Middle Ages, where I study this subject, but then I branched out in the 90s to look at it in many places, is what I call apocalyptic millenarianism. And I use the term millenarianism is the belief that at some point in the future, the world will become a perfect place. And there are both religious versions of this, like Christian beliefs in the kingdom of heaven descending to earth at Jesus's return. There are secular versions, like the communist idea of the end of the capitalist system and the arrival of the communist system and so on. So that's millennialism. It's a belief that at some point in the future, the world will become a perfect place of peace and harmony and justice and abundance and brotherhood. Apocalyptic I use to refer to the belief that that time is now, that it's happening in our lifetime. And so you have various forms of apocalyptic millennial thinking. Some of them are very peaceful. I think, when I was a youth in the late 60s and early 70s, that, the Woodstock generation believed that, it was time for love and peace and brotherhood to take over the world. But the most dangerous form of apocalyptic millennialism is what I call active cataclysmic apocalyptic. And that's the belief that there is a time that in order for the perfect world to come, you have to clear away evil. And in clearing away evil, it will take an enormous amount of destruction. Now, for instance, the Christian rapture belief in the end of time, it's God who does that. God will bring about the destruction that will clear the way for the millennium, and the good people will be raptured, taken up into the heavens while this devastation happens on earth, and then they'll return to enjoy the millennium on earth. In other versions, and in fact, the more secular the belief, the more likely you're going to get this version. In other versions, it's the believers themselves who are the agents of the destruction. And that's what I call active cataclysmic. So, for instance, the communists are a good example. The Nazis are a good example. In India, and not in India, in China, in the mid-19th century, from 1850 to 1864, there was a millennial war between the leaders of a movement called the Taiping, which literally means heaven on earth, against the Qin dynasty that was ruling in Beijing. And it was 14 years of war. And estimates are that over 30 million Chinese died in this war. So we're talking about movements of megadeath. And when we get to the caliphators, there are caliphators who believe, like Yusuf al-Qaradawi, that this can happen peacefully, that we'll just preach the truth of Islam to people and they will convert. But the jihadis like Hamas, like Hezbollah, like ISIS, like Al-Qaeda believe that they are the agents of Allah's destruction of evil in this world, and that they have to bring it about. And what we've in fact seen since 2001, is that there is a sort of nice cop, tough cop routine that's being played. The jihadis attack, and then what's called dawah, the summons to the faith, the cognitive warriors, the nonviolent warriors, will then step in and say, look, if you want to avoid these people killing you, you have to behave. Either you have to convert, and there were many conversions to Islam after 9/11. Osama bin Laden crowed that he was now the strong horse, and people in the West laughed at him, but in fact, he was right. So on the one hand, you have either conversion, or you have to behave like a dhimmi, that is a non-Muslim, an infidel, ruled over by Muslims, in which case you accept a degraded condition, a legally degraded condition, so it's like apartheid, but also a psychologically degraded position. And one of the things that you are absolutely forbidden is to criticize Islam. So you have anybody who tried to say, look, global jihad is an Islamic movement, got accused of Islamophobia. And Islamophobia was such a powerful accusation that people were afraid to say anything about it. In England, you had, for over a decade, you had I'm guessing it's still going on, you had Pakistani Muslims who had moved to England and who were systematically raping and grooming British schoolgirls down to the age of 10 and 11 to be sex slaves, And nobody wanted to talk about it because they'd be accused of Islamophobia, and that meant the police. It meant the heads of schools. It meant the teachers. It meant the social workers. It was a total disaster, and it was all because people were terrified if they said something nasty about Muslims, they would be accused of Islamophobia. So the caliphators are both the violent ones and the allegedly nonviolent ones. But I think just like Arafat said about the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, they're nonviolent because they're not in a position to be violent now. But if they could, I have no doubt that they would. And what we saw in response to Hamas's attack on Israel was, in fact, that all these people, like in the West, we have I don't know if you have it in India, but in the United States and in Europe, there's a movement called BDS, Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions, which is and they present themselves as a civil society movement, a nonviolent movement for Palestinian human rights. And so you would normally expect a movement like that, a nonviolent movement, to be shocked by what Hamas did. And instead, they were cheering and leading these demonstrations against Israel. So again, we're dealing with a force that is very powerful, has enormous appeal to Muslims, particularly Muslim youth. The epigram that I wrote for my book was, if I were a Muslim, I would take the stupidity of Westerners as a sign from Allah that I should join jihad. I can understand why somebody who is a fervent Muslim, a pious Muslim, would be appealed to by this notion that finally Islam is going to establish a global caliphate. So that's my analysis of the situation.
And I have like two last questions. And one of them I wanted to ask you, Professor. A lot of Western audience, as we were talking about, do not understand this concept that, let's say for Iran, an eschatological belief might be the army of the banners, that they
Right.
want to go to Jerusalem and raise the black flags. An army will come from Khorasan. But for them, it might be an eschatological or like a religious belief. But for someone like in Iran, a state, it would want an ambition. It's not just an eschatological belief, but it's an ambition. And in this context, I want to ask you about your book. It talks about the influence of Islamist ideology in Western academia and media.
Right.
Could you explain how this influence manifests and its potential consequences? Because they do not interpret it the way it should be seen. They have seen it as like an eschatological belief or an ideological belief, which will not manifest into a reality.
Right. So there are two aspects of this. One specifically dealing with Iran, which is that, up until 1979 and Khomeini's takeover of Iran, the whole issue of nuclear weapons was governed by the principle, the control of nuclear, the prevention of nuclear war was based on the principle called MAD, M-A-D, which is mutual assured destruction. And the idea was that nobody's going to start an atomic war because it would destroy their own people. So, we may dislike each other, but we're not so insane as to be suicidal about our dislikes. That's not the case for apocalyptic believers. For them, the destruction of their own people, if it can lead to the destruction of their apocalyptic enemy, is just fun. And in fact, in a moment of anger, uncharacteristic anger by Mahmoud Abbas, he denounced Hamas after this attack and said, these people are crazy. They are going to destroy the people. They don't care about the people. And I think that's true of the Iranian jihadis with their nuclear weapons. So the idea that you can deal with Iran, a nuclear Iran, the way you dealt with a nuclear Russia or China is, in fact, a deep mistake. That's point one. Point two is that in the West, and I had enormous trouble as a medieval historian getting other medieval historians to take seriously beliefs about apocalyptic beliefs in the Middle Ages. Amongst Westerners, apocalyptic beliefs are crazy people, and we don't take them seriously. And they've always been wrong. But my point is, they may be wrong, but that doesn't mean they're inconsequential. The Nazis only had 12 years of their millennial Tausendjährige Reich, but in those 12 years, they did unbelievable damage, including killing more Germans than they killed Jews. I mean, more Germans got killed as a result of what they did than they killed Jews. And so what happens in the West is, and again, this gets back to this sort of cognitive egocentrism of the West, we translate into our language what they're about. So, for instance, the chant "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," which is very popular these days. There's not going to be a free Palestine. If Hamas takes over, and they will take over if the PA takes over, they'll knock them out just as they did in Gaza. If the jihadis take over, that's not going to be a free society, but we translate it into what we understand. So for the Western academics, the Palestinian movement is a nationalist movement aimed at having freedom and dignity and human rights. And as a result, they're completely unaware of this stuff. So after 7/10, all of a sudden, people like Bruce Hoffman are writing articles in the Atlantic Monthly saying, about Hamas's genocidal ideology. Well, those of us who were talking about Hamas's genocidal ideology before then were considered Islamophobes. I, in fact, had a good deal of trouble getting my book published because nobody wanted to be accused of publishing Islamophobic material.
I can completely understand. And that is one of the reasons, actually, I really wanted to talk to you about this, because I felt a part of your book, actually, what you mentioned, is something which we as an Indian society relate as well. And this is where I wanted to ask you my last question as what is happening around in Israel right now. And your book has an overarching theme of the Arab-Israeli conflict.
Right.
Now, how do you view the role of the West in this conflict? And how does it relate to your larger thesis, probably? And
right.
What you've seen currently, what you're seeing at this point of time.
Right.
When I read a part of your chapter, I feel it's already been said and you've already been predicting this before, that if this happens, this will happen
Right.
exactly the way the West is behaving.
Yeah. So it's interesting because my book came out a year ago and it had, I was on a number of podcasts and so on. But then after 7/10, a friend of mine who had done a review of the book and couldn't get it published anywhere, and finally, after multiple revisions to make sure it wasn't saying bad things about Muslims, but only about caliphators and so on and so forth, got it published. And the title of the review was "The Book That Saw 7/10," that is the attack in October 7th, "The Book That Saw 7/10 Coming a Mile Away." And now all of a sudden, I'm getting a sort of second look from people who are saying, maybe we should read this book. But I think the larger issue, when you ask about the Western behavior in this, I think the larger issue is as follows. There is going to be increasing pressure on Israel to withdraw from Gaza. The whole Arab world is aflame with propaganda from Hamas. That's relayed by European and Western media, which focuses ferociously on the suffering of the Palestinians, and therefore is constantly showing pictures of the victimization of the Gazans by the Israeli activity. World War II could not have been won if there had been a press like this covering it. So what's happening is there's going to be pressure. First of all, the Arab world is aflame, and the leaders in the Arab world, even the ones who want to make peace with Israel, like Saudi Arabia, are under heavy pressure from the street to do something. And so they're pressuring the United States to tell Israel to back off. Israel cannot back off. It's between a rock and a hard place. It must exterminate Hamas. It must root it out. In the same way that the Americans and the Allies in World War II rooted out the Nazis and rooted out the Japanese nationalist ideology that had led Japan to their atrocious behavior against China and others in World War II. So we're in a situation where we've got to do this. We cannot allow a movement that's capable of what they did on 7/10 to continue to hold on. And instead of the reporting covering the way in which Hamas literally sacrifices its people, it seeks to have its own people killed in order to denounce Israel, as long as that's the take, rather than, I mean, in order to blame Israel, and as long as the media cooperates with this blaming of Israel for the deaths of Gazans, the impossible situation will continue and may even force Israel to withdraw, or if it continues, to forfeit an enormous amount of support that it needs in the rest of the world. I don't know if you saw this, but there were pictures. There was a young boy on a bicycle with his cell phone taking pictures of people who had been shot on the road to the south, where people were fleeing from the north. And it was women, and it was children, it was a girl, it was a baby. And immediately groups like in America, one of these Dawa organizations that supports Hamas, namely CARE, Committee for Islamic American Relations, came out and denounced the Israelis for their genocidal warfare. Now, it's pretty clear that it's Hamas who is shooting these people because they didn't want people fleeing south, because they want them to protect Hamas in the north. And so when Israelis bombed the Jabalia refugee camp, they want it full of refugees to be killed so that they can then go cry to the world. And the world is stupid enough to blame Israel rather than to blame Hamas. And I really think that until the West faces the fact that for the last 23 years, since 2000, they have been systematically duped by a movement that is genocidal to sympathize with the people whose deaths they are arranging in order to get the West to cry over these poor civilians and blame Israel. Until the West can grapple with this, and until the media can stop their insane obsession with showing Palestinian victimization and with running headlines that basically give Hamas propaganda, radically false propaganda, credibility, until that happens, I would say democracies are in serious danger. They've been infiltrated. American academia has been literally occupied by people who are supporters of Hamas. And for the longest time, people like me who saw this happening thought, well, when they see what these people are really about, then they'll change. And this terrifying thing, and I think even more terrifying than what happened in the South, is the fact that all across the West, people responded to what Hamas did by cheering. So, we're in bad shape. We got a Congress, I think I mentioned it, Rashida Tlaib is accusing the President of the United States of supporting the genocide of the Palestinian people.
So, Professor, before I let you go, one last thing I want to ask you is, I was watching your conversation in the Begin Center, and you started with this quote of how Jews are perceived as the Nazis, actually, in the Western academia and the media, for even exercising the right to own defense. I want to understand this last thing before you let us go, that while we're seeing the West is in flames right now by the same Islamists whom they have perceived as giving shelters when the refugees were coming in large numbers, and we see France is in flames right now. We see Britain, by the way, is in flames. America, for example, the American heroes for independence their statues were being desecrated. So while we see this happening around the world, how long will the Western academia, media, not realize that it's just not what happens in Israel, just stays in Israel, but it's just coming to the West as well.
Right, right. Well, I mean, I've been saying this for a long time, and it's in my book, but it's also, I have a blog that I was very active from about 2005 to 2015. And then I started working on my book full time. I have a blog, and I've written repeatedly that the soft underbelly of the West, the way that the caliphators can invade the West is through their receptivity to stories about Jews behaving badly. Now, is this anti-Semitism? Is this some less intense but nonetheless very strong hostility to Jews? I have an article in Fathom Journal that's going to come out shortly where I address this issue. But in any case, it's there. People, I remember a friend of mine who repeatedly, after the Oslo war broke out, saying to me after Jenin and so on, well, this time Israel's lost the moral high ground. And this idea that Israel's lost the moral high ground seems to appeal enormously, primarily to progressives. And as a result, they're so blinded by the good feeling they have about themselves being on the moral high ground and Israel losing it by being shamed by these stories that the press circulates and that academics amplify. They're so pleased by this that they don't realize that they are literally being invaded by their susceptibility to this propaganda. And again, the misunderstanding, and people are constantly doing this because they want somehow to believe that the Palestinian people are a good people. And I'm willing to believe that Palestinian people are capable of being a good people. But right now, for the last 30 years, since Oslo, they have been in the grip of a leadership that has constantly fed them genocidal hatred of the Jews. And Western academia and Western journalists have processed this as not hatred of the Jews, but of resistance to Israel. So, for instance, the BBC literally, when they're translating statements from the Palestinians that talk about how we want to massacre every last Yahud, which is a Jew, they translate Yahud as Israeli, and they defend that translation. And that's not what's going on. And yet, literally, it's a kind of auto-stupefaction. They are making themselves stupid. And they are making their own societies vulnerable to people who hate them. I remember in 2015, I was writing about Germany letting in 1 million people, invoking the Holocaust and saying, no, this is Wiedergutmachen. We're not going to do to these poor refugees what we did to the Jews. And what they're doing is letting in people who have been bred on a genocidal ideology very similar to the Nazis into their own countries, people who hate them as much as they hate the Jews, or maybe just a little less. And it's insane. It's literally insane.
I mean, I can completely understand the situation, Professor, but thank you so much for taking your time. That's all the question that I had. I would definitely put a link for people to buy the book. And
Okay.
sure, people should read the book here in India as well, because what is happening in Israel is not something that even we face as well. For a lot of our stories being misinterpreted, so it's a sure read for a lot of us.
You know the expression "canary in the mine shaft."
What is it?
So when miners would work in tunnels, the mine shafts, they would have a canary. And as long as the canary was chirping, the air was okay. But if the canary stopped, it was a sign that gases were escaping and they had to get out. Now, this is a different kind of canary in the mine shaft. We're chirping wildly that we're only the first victim. The rest of the democratic world is next. And we're basically speaking to people who have got, their their CDs plugged into their ears, and they're listening to their whatever it's called, tapes of their favorite songs, and they're just not listening. Thank you.
I can completely understand, Professor, because that's what we feel sometimes as well. But thank you, Professor. Thank you so much for taking your time and speaking.
You're welcome. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.